You're watching VinylicPumaGaming. General, another settlement needs our help. Preston Garvey, 2287. You know, wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to hear Preston Garvey say that almost every single time you talk to him in Sanctuary? While you can currently avoid talking to Preston Garvey entirely and ultimately opt to take a massive detour around Concord, most people that play Fallout 4 for the first time are going to encounter Preston Garvey, and they're also going to inevitably be informed by Preston that another settlement needs their help. But what if the player was actually able to kill Preston Garvey in Fallout 4? Sure, you wouldn't have to hear him say that anymore, but what consequences would killing Preston Garvey have on the game's story? Would it massively change Fallout 4's plot, or could most things go on as Bethesda originally intended? Today, I want to discuss what would happen if you were able to kill Preston Garvey in Fallout 4, and if it would really have any effect on Fallout 4's plot. But before we can discuss whether killing Preston Garvey or not matters, let's go over some of his backstory as well as the backstory for the Minutemen. According to Preston himself, he joined the Minutemen when he turned 17 under Ezra Hollis's company. He states that he was happy to join and that the Minutemen were his heroes as a kid because he felt that they were the only good guys around in the Commonwealth. Preston goes on to mention that at some point in 2282, 5 years before the events of Fallout 4 take place, General Becker, who was the last general of the Minutemen, died and that various members couldn't agree on who would replace him. Becker's death would split the Minutemen and would have Preston sticking with Colonel HOLLIS. In 2287, sometime before the sole survivor exits Vault 111, Colonel HOLLIS, along with Preston Garvey, received a request for aid from STURGES, who was working and living in QUINCY at the time. This was because a mercenary group called the Gunners was attacking the town, and according to Preston, Colonel HOLLIS's group of Minutemen were the only ones that came to the aid of QUINCY, and that the other groups of Minutemen simply turned their backs on QUINCY. In fact, Colonel HOLLIS expected some reinforcements from other Minutemen groups to come and help him. However, they never came. And even worse, a former Minuteman turned gunner by the name of Clint betrayed Colonel HOLLIS, and the Gunners were ultimately able to take QUINCY and managed to wipe out Colonel HOLLIS's company as well as the vast majority of the town's inhabitants. Preston, however, was able to escape with approximately 20 other people, and by the time Preston reaches Concord, where we first meet him in the game, only 5 people remain. They are Preston, Mama Murphy, Sturges, Marcy, and Jun Long. Preston is the only living survivor of Colonel HOLLIS's company of the Minutemen and essentially becomes the last Minuteman. After meeting Preston, the rest of Preston's story is how you choose to define it. You can either return the Minutemen to their former glory and help them defeat the Institute, or you can largely ignore the faction and seek the aid of the other factions in the Commonwealth. Of course, we can't talk about Preston without talking about the history of the Commonwealth Minutemen. According to one of Fallout 4's loading screens, the Minutemen first rose to prominence in the year 2180 when they defended Diamond City against a horde of super mutants. Loading screens go on to mention that the Minutemen would eventually go on to make their headquarters at Fort Independence, which is known in the game as the Castle. And the loading screens also indicate that the castle fell in the 2240s under the command of General McGann. This was due to a Mirelurk attack on the fort, and as the player discovers, McGann managed to lock the armory, preserving it for when the player manages to reclaim the fort 40 years later. The loss of the castle would ultimately prove to be too much for the Minutemen. About 40 years later, General Becker dies, and this event would prove to further weaken the Minutemen. As we discussed with Preston, Colonel HOLLIS attempts to aid the people of QUINCY in 2287, none of the other Minutemen companies show up, and Colonel HOLLIS's company is utterly massacred by Gunners led by a former Minuteman named Clint. This is ultimately the end of the Minutemen until the sole survivor comes along and decides to change things for the better. Now, with all of that backstory out of the way, I think it's time that we discussed Preston Garvey's importance to Fallout 4's plot. For first-time players, Preston Garvey, along with the Minutemen questline, is what teaches people how to put together their own settlements. You get to learn the basics of settlement defense, resource acquisition, and settler recruitment. Preston also provides the player with various quests to aid settlements seeking to join the Minutemen, as well as quests to offer aid to existing settlements. Now, most of the quests that Preston gives are Radiant quests. However, Preston also allows the player to acquire the artillery guns for settlements once they've acquired the castle and reactivated Radio Freedom. Depending on how you decide to play through Fallout 4, you can choose to side with the Minutemen during the molecular level quest. Provided you decide to become hostile with the Institute, this will result in a mission that has the player defending the castle from a synth invasion, and eventually, the Minutemen will infiltrate the Institute and cause a nuclear detonation in a similar way to the Brotherhood of Steel and the Railroad. The Minutemen ending is one of Fallout 4's 4 vanilla game endings, with the other 3 being the Brotherhood, Railroad, and Institute endings. At the same time, while the Minutemen can be central to Fallout 4's main plot, it's possible to avoid the encounter with Preston in Concord entirely. While this scenario is unlikely for new players, it's actually very likely for veteran players who already understand how settlement construction works and don't want to get involved with the Minutemen from the very start. In fact, it's possible to complete the Nuka World DLC and then meet Preston Garvey in Concord with no consequences. Normally, if you meet the Minutemen early on and then you join the Nuka World Raiders and start attacking settlements, Preston gets extremely upset and may decide to never be your companion ever again. So you might be wondering, what if you could kill Preston? Well, you can't. Preston is considered by the game as an essential NPC, meaning he can't be killed unless you use console commands to remove his essential status. So in a sense, even if you wanted to kill Preston, you can't because the game won't let you the way Bethesda designed it. What is really strange about this is that you could go through an entire playthrough of Fallout 4 without even meeting Preston or going to Concord if you really wanted to. While this does require a detour around Concord, Preston and the Minutemen aren't essential to Fallout 4's main plot. Even the Railroad is more essential to Fallout 4's main plot than the Minutemen are, and they arguably have the least popular ending among the player base. So, assuming you were able to kill Preston, there wouldn't be much effect on the entire story of Fallout 4. I would say, even from a lore perspective, many of the citizens of the Commonwealth think that the Minutemen are pretty much done and don't stand a chance at getting back together. So if Preston could be killed, I'm not sure anyone would miss him. When you first assist the settlers at either Ten Pines Bluff or Oberlin Station as a part of the Minutemen, they act surprised that the Minutemen actually came to help them, and they assumed that they were all wiped out at the QUINCY massacre. And again, Preston's situation is interesting. While the game considers him to be essential, there wouldn't really be much impact on the game if you were able to kill him. I also think that it's really interesting that Preston is essential while the other faction leaders like Father, Elder Maxon, and Desdemona aren't essential and can be killed if the player chooses to do so. In fact, it's possible to kill Father and Elder Maxon upon meeting them for the very first time. As a quasi-faction leader, you would think that Bethesda would allow you to kill Preston when the other leaders of the various factions can be killed. What if you wanted to establish an independent Commonwealth from all 4 of the factions? It's surprising that this isn't even an option. Okay, so let's say that Bethesda allowed us to kill Preston. Well, what would happen if that was the case? Assuming Fallout 4's plot would progress on its same path, things wouldn't really be a whole lot different. Maybe you wouldn't run into Preston at Concord, but you would still get to Diamond City. Piper would help you get into Diamond City. You'd still search for and find Nick. You'd hunt down and kill Kellogg. You'd find Virgil. You'd meet the Railroad. You'd build the teleporter, and you would teleport into the Institute. From there, you would either side with Father, you would side with the Railroad, or you would side with the Brotherhood of Steel. The only complication you would run into is if you were to kill Father as soon as you met him and downloaded the data into the network scanner. Apparently, when you work with the Brotherhood or Railroad to get in, both factions will ultimately make you work with the Minutemen if you kill Father. If you were able to kill Preston Garvey, this would make it so that the Minutemen wouldn't be around, and thus you couldn't complete Fallout 4's main story. Obviously, Bethesda intentionally designed the game around not being able to kill Preston Garvey by making him essential. From a design standpoint, this makes sense because you wouldn't want the player to be able to kill Father and then not be able to progress through the main story. At the same time, Preston Garvey and the Minutemen can be so inconsequential to Fallout 4's main plot that it doesn't matter if you meet them or not. That said, Bethesda did design Fallout 4 in such a way as to make us think that the Minutemen were a crucial part of Fallout 4's plot, and if you go right into Sanctuary and talk to Codsworth, he's going to suggest that you investigate Concord, where you will inevitably meet the Minutemen. As I've said previously, Preston and the Minutemen's purpose within Fallout 4 is interesting in the sense that they both do and really don't matter. It would be possible to progress through the story without Preston and the Minutemen. Heck, if you knew what you were doing, you could even build settlements without the Minutemen being there to guide you along the way. But what if things were different? Before I start here, it's important to mention that all of this I'm going to discuss from here on out is going to be speculation. Everything going forward is going to be hypothetical, so you've been warned. One of the criticisms of Fallout 4 is that many people felt that a lot of their choices really didn't matter. A great example of this is when you start to track down and find Kellogg in Fort Hagen, the game forces you to kill him. You can't choose to spare Kellogg at all, even if you wanted to. If you could spare Kellogg, it would have certainly had a major effect on Fallout 4's plot, and maybe Kellogg would help the player get into the Institute without the help of the other three factions. I think another great example is for 3 of Fallout 4's endings. The Minutemen, Brotherhood, and Railroad all conclude the main quest with the nuclear option, which involves infiltrating the Institute, setting off the alarm, and blowing up the Institute by pushing a button at the mass fusion building. In this case, the only ending that is truly different is if you side with the Institute, which will involve you wiping out both the Railroad and Brotherhood. And yes, while it's true that there are significant differences in how the Minutemen, Railroad, and Brotherhood get into the Institute, you'll ultimately find that all of the endings ultimately result in blowing up the Institute with a nuke. But I digress. What I think would have been more interesting for Fallout 4 is if what happened in Concord was different. As Fallout 4's story currently is, Preston and company are held up in the Museum of Freedom in Concord, defending themselves from a group of raiders. What would have conformed more to this idea of player choice was if you could choose to help Preston and the Minutemen fight off the raiders, or you could have chosen to side with the raiders and wipe out Preston and the Minutemen. Perhaps if Fallout 4 had more development time, Porter Gage would be leading the assault on the Minutemen in Concord as opposed to the generic enemy that we got by the name of Gristle. Or Gristle could have been more like Porter Gage from the Nuka World DLC. This would have had a profound effect on Fallout 4's settlement system at the game's launch. You could have had a more traditional way to acquire and build new settlements, which involved retaking the Commonwealth as the good guys, or you could have looted and pillaged the Commonwealth and put citizens into slavery. This would have also fulfilled a feeling that players could be evil in Fallout 4, as the game's mechanics would change if you decided to kill Garvey and the Minutemen. Another interesting scenario in Concord could involve 2 of the Minutemen's biggest enemies. You have the Gunners, who were responsible for wiping out Colonel Hollis' detachment of the Minutemen, and you have the Super Mutants, who always seem to be a threat regardless of what faction you play. So maybe instead of raiders, Preston and company are fending off either gunners or a bunch of super mutants. Just like you could with the raiders before, you could choose between Preston or a gunner commander. This would have been an amazing opportunity to flesh out the gunners more as far as the lore is concerned, as they are currently very mysterious to pretty much the entire player base. Perhaps gunner settlements would be similar to the current Minutemen settlement system, but would allow you to build and construct a lot more sophisticated military hardware. Bethesda could have even included an entire quest line like they did for the Minutemen, except it involves the Gunners. The same thing goes with the Super Mutants. If you're able to side with the Super Mutants against Preston Garvey and company, perhaps this would allow you to befriend the Super Mutants and put you on the path of joining their faction. Perhaps the player could even eventually become a Super Mutant and gain the ability to build Super Mutant-style settlements. Either way, having either the super mutants or gunners attack Preston and company would have had some interesting effects on the game's plot and would have been really cool in my personal opinion. Or perhaps Fallout 4 would give you several different opportunities to kill Preston. Instead of having to immediately kill Preston in Concord, what if you could side with Preston initially, only to betray him for either the Nuka World Raider gangs, the gunners, or even the super mutants later on? It would have been really interesting if you were able to build up the Minutemen somewhat, then betray them for the Brotherhood of Steel, and this would result in some kind of small war between both factions. While you can betray the Brotherhood with the Minutemen, you can't really do this the other way around as Preston Garvey, and that's because the guy is just an essential NPC. Even if you really manage to piss off Preston, you remain in command of the Minutemen regardless. Perhaps in addition to wiping out the Railroad and the Brotherhood of Steel, Father would ask you to wipe out the Minutemen and kill Preston Garvey if you've developed enough settlements or if you've managed to retake the castle. The game considers the Minutemen to pretty much be the default good faction in the game, and if you were able to portray them and wipe them out with an Institute invasion of the castle, that would also have players feeling like they could be evil in Fallout 4. Or maybe you could just complete the game, you decided you didn't like the Minutemen anymore, and you wanted to wipe out every settlement that you just built, killing all of the Minutemen in the process. The ability to simply do this would have made people feel like they had more control over their choices than they currently do with Fallout 4 as it is. I think the ability to kill Preston would make most people that played Fallout 4 feel like they had a lot more choices, and that they had some control over how the plot progresses. While I'm not as much of a fan of Fallout New Vegas, I can't deny that this was definitely one of New Vegas's strengths. In addition to the branching endings that you could have with the NCR, Legion, or even a Mr. House victory, you also had the ability to go down your own path and establish your own independent New Vegas. Fallout 4, on the other hand, requires you to choose one of the 4 factions if you wish to complete the game. There's no opportunity to take down the Institute by yourself without the aid of either the Brotherhood, Railroad, or Minutemen. Furthermore, you can't wipe out all 4 factions if you really wanted to, leaving the Commonwealth in complete ruin. Even if Bethesda didn't really change anything in Fallout 4, the ability to kill Preston wouldn't have affected the plot that much. You would still either go through the nuclear option with either the Brotherhood or Railroad, and you would complete Nuclear Family if you decided to side with Father in the Institute. While there would have to be some tweaking done if the player decided to kill Father on their first meeting, perhaps Bethesda could have just an AO step up and take Father's place when either the Railroad or Brotherhood make their final assault on the Institute. That said, it would probably be a little bit better though if Bethesda did allow you to choose between 2 factions in Concord. That way, if you did kill Father, it would lock you out of the Brotherhood or Railroad endings, but it would allow you to choose between siding with the Minutemen or deciding to choose to side with either the Raiders, the Gunners, the Super Mutants, or whatever Bethesda ultimately decided to do. At the end of the day, I think I just wish Bethesda gave us some more choices in Fallout 4, and maybe I wish there were more consequences for wiping out the Minutemen, assuming you could actually do it in the game. Really, there aren't any, and I think that's a shame because there was a lot of potential here. Alright guys, that's going to pretty much wrap up this particular video. If you like this video, please be sure to leave a like, and as always, take care, and I'll see y'all next time.